Ronald Gene Simmons was a man whose life was shaped by an unyielding need for control, a need that manifested most tragically and destructively in his role as the head of his family. From his youth in rural Arkansas, Simmons was exposed to an environment steeped in rigid discipline, conservatism, and an often harsh sense of authority. Born in 1940, he grew up during a time when the culture was deeply patriarchal and notions of male dominance were rarely questioned. In his formative years, the seeds of his controlling nature took root, shaped by family dynamics and societal expectations that placed the man's word as law. These early influences melded with his personal temperament, a volatile combination of aggression, pride, and a ruthless desire for dominance. His enlistment and long tenure in the United States Air Force only served to reinforce these traits. The military environment, structured, hierarchical, and authoritarian, matched his personality like a mold. Within the confines of military life, Simmons thrived under order and discipline, and his service further hardened his views on power and obedience. However, his stern exterior masked a growing inner turmoil. While he commanded respect and adhered to rules professionally, his personal life was increasingly marked by an inability to regulate his anger and impulses. When he retired from the Air Force, Simmons carried with him the discipline and control mechanisms of military life, but these were distorted in the civilian setting into a form of oppressive tyranny over his family. Settling his large family in a remote farmhouse in Dover, Arkansas, Simmons found the perfect setting to impose his will. The farm was isolated, lacking many modern amenities such as indoor plumbing or central heating, which contributed to an environment of hardship and self-sufficiency. Yet this isolation was not incidental. It was a calculated means to keep the family cut off from outside influence and scrutiny. Simmons's control extended beyond mere physical boundaries. He sought to control the very lives and minds of those around him. In this remote pocket of the world, he crafted a microcosm where he was the undisputed master and where resistance was not just discouraged but punished severely. Within this household, Simmons's behavior was brutally authoritarian. He demanded absolute obedience from his wife, children, and extended family members who lived with him. Discipline was meted out with cruel and violent hands. Frequent beatings were administered for even the smallest acts of defiance or perceived disrespect. Simmons was known to use belts, wooden boards, and his fists to inflict punishment, leaving his family physically marked and psychologically scarred. The beatings were not random acts of rage, but calculated tools designed to instill fear and submission. This environment bred an atmosphere where silence and compliance were the only ways to survive. His family lived perpetually on edge, always anticipating the next outburst. However, Simmons's abuse was not limited to physical violence. He was a master manipulator who used psychological terror to maintain control. He isolated family members from one another and from the outside world, ensuring they had no allies or sources of support. He fostered distrust between siblings, sowing seeds of suspicion so that they would not band together against him. His control extended into every aspect of their daily lives, dictating what they wore, when they ate, and whom they could speak to. Emotional abuse accompanied the physical violence, as Simmons demeaned and belittled family members, reinforcing their powerlessness and dependence on him. His reign was one of total domination. One of the most horrific elements of Simmons's control was his incestuous relationship with his daughter Sheila. Over many years, he subjected her to repeated sexual abuse, a profound betrayal of the paternal bond. This abuse was hidden from the outside world but known within the family, casting a shadow over their already fragile lives. The trauma inflicted on Sheila was compounded when she became pregnant with his child. Rather than seek help or show remorse, Simmons doubled down on secrecy and control, moving the family multiple times to evade detection and legal consequences. The incest was both a symptom and a cause of the family's dysfunction, embedding layers of fear, shame, and helplessness that would fracture their lives irreparably. The isolation Simmons imposed was comprehensive. The family had virtually no contact with neighbors or authorities, a factor that shielded Simmons from external intervention. The children rarely left the farm unaccompanied, and contact with schools or social services was minimal or non-existent. This vacuum of oversight created a closed system where Simmons's abuses could escalate unchecked. The silence surrounding the family's suffering was both a symptom of the control and a tool used to reinforce it. By severing ties with the outside world, Simmons ensured that the family's pain remained hidden and his authority went unchallenged. To those outside his immediate family, Simmons maintained a facade of normalcy and even respectability. Neighbors and co-workers described him as quiet, stern, and somewhat surly, but not overtly threatening. He worked as a security guard after his military retirement and was known to be difficult, but generally kept to himself. This duality allowed him to conceal the depth of his abuse and control, perpetuating a dangerous illusion. The contrast between his public persona and the brutal reality at home is a chilling reminder of how abusers can hide behind masks of normalcy. Simmons's patriarchal dominance extended beyond his immediate family. Women and children were especially subjected to his rigid control and violence. The household was governed by strict gender roles, with men wielding power and women and children expected to be submissive and obedient. This extreme patriarchy left little room for dissent or individuality. The consequences of disobedience were severe, reinforcing the culture of fear that pervaded the household. The psychological toll on the family was immense. Many lived in a state of constant anxiety and emotional numbness, their identities shaped by the need to survive their father's wrath. This control was not merely personal but systemic within the family structure. Simmons demanded total loyalty and obedience, punishing any signs of resistance with swift and violent retribution. The family's dynamic was built on fear, intimidation, and control, with Simmons as the unchallenged authority figure. This pattern of abuse and control left long-lasting scars, traumatizing survivors and disrupting familial bonds. The damage went beyond physical injuries, deeply affecting mental health and interpersonal relationships. The horrifying climax of Ronald Gene Simmons' life came during the dark days of Christmas 1987, when the man who had ruled his family with iron fists and brutal control unleashed a wave of unimaginable violence. Over the course of nearly a week, Simmons systematically murdered 16 people, including 14 members of his own family. These killings were not impulsive acts of rage, but a calculated, cold-blooded campaign of death that revealed the terrifying extent of his psychological breakdown and his desire for total domination, even in death. To understand the murders, one must first appreciate the methodical nature with which Simmons approached them. Unlike chaotic, spontaneous crimes of passion, Simmons' spree was planned and executed with chilling precision. For years, the seeds of violence had been germinating beneath the surface, hidden by a facade of grim normality. But by late December 1987, something within Simmons snapped irrevocably. Whether motivated by a desire for revenge, control, or a twisted sense of justice, Simmons set out to annihilate his family in a series of premeditated killings that stunned the nation. The massacre began on December 22, 1987, at Simmons' home in Dover, Arkansas. It was a cold winter day, with the family preparing for the upcoming Christmas holiday. To any outsider, this should have been a time of celebration and togetherness, but for Simmons, it was the day he began his deadly purge. He first targeted his wife, Shirley, with whom his relationship had been fraught for years with abuse and cruelty. The murder of Shirley was particularly brutal. Simmons shot her in the head at close range, ending years of torment in an instant. This act, horrific as it was, marked the beginning of a week-long killing spree that would engulf the entire family. Following the murder of his wife, Simmons turned his attention to his children and grandchildren. Over the next several days, he hunted down and systematically killed 14 of his family members, including his own sons, daughters, grandchildren, and even extended family who had sought refuge at the farmhouse. The violence was indiscriminate yet calculated. No one was spared, and Simmons employed a variety of methods, mostly shooting with a rifle, to dispatch his victims swiftly and mercilessly. What made these killings even more chilling was the cold detachment with which Simmons carried them out. Witnesses who would later come forward described him as eerily calm and composed during the entire spree, as if he were merely carrying out a grim duty rather than committing atrocities. His military background likely contributed to this methodical approach. Simmons moved through the house with the efficiency of a trained soldier, eliminating each target with precision and minimal fuss. This was not the work of a man driven by chaotic madness, but a terrifyingly focused executioner. The victims included members of Simmons' immediate family, his adult children and grandchildren, as well as other relatives who had gathered for the holidays. Among them were his daughter Sheila, whose lifelong abuse by Simmons had cast a long shadow over the family, and his son, who had tried unsuccessfully to stand up to their father's tyranny in the past. The youngest victim was a toddler, barely 2 years old, who had no understanding of the violence unfolding around him. Each death was a tragic loss, and together they formed a dark tableau of familial destruction. Simmons' motives for the killings remain subject to debate among criminologists and psychologists. Some experts speculate that Simmons, facing the prospect of losing control over his family, either through aging, changing circumstances, or potential exposure, chose to destroy them rather than allow them to escape his grasp. Others point to his deeply disturbed psyche, warped by years of abuse, isolation, and mental illness, which culminated in a desire to exact final, irreversible punishment on those he saw as extensions of his own suffering and failure. Regardless of motive, the sheer scale and coldness of the murders suggest a man who had detached himself from any remaining sense of humanity. But the killing spree did not end with his family. On December 29th, after nearly a week of carnage, Simmons left his rural home and went to a local restaurant in Russellville, Arkansas, where he worked as a security guard. There, he murdered 2 co-workers, John and Mary Allen, further extending the reach of his violence beyond the confines of his family. The motives behind these murders were less clear, but they underscored the extent of his descent into violence and his readiness to kill strangers without hesitation. Following the murders at the restaurant, Simmons fled the scene but did not attempt to evade capture for long. Within hours, he surrendered calmly to law enforcement, showing no signs of remorse or resistance. This unusual surrender was a stark contrast to the brutality of his crimes and added to the mystique of a man who appeared both terrifyingly dangerous and eerily resigned. His surrender marked the end of the killing spree, but only the beginning of a long and complex legal saga that would ultimately lead to his execution. The investigation into the murders revealed the full extent of Simmons' crimes and the horrors endured by his family. Authorities were shocked by the scale of the massacre and the cold efficiency with which it had been carried out. The forensic evidence, combined with eyewitness accounts and Simmons' own admissions, painted a grim picture of a man who had meticulously planned and executed a reign of terror against those closest to him. The discovery of the bodies in the farmhouse was one of the most grisly crime scenes in Arkansas history and remains a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty. During the trial, Simmons' defense attempted to portray him as mentally ill and incapable of controlling his actions. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a man plagued by severe psychological disorders, including signs of antisocial personality disorder and possible psychosis. Yet despite this, the jury found him fully responsible for the murders, concluding that his actions were premeditated and deliberate. The verdict was unanimous. Simmons was sentenced to death for his crimes, a sentence he accepted without protest. Simmons spent the next few years on death row, where he remained calm and composed, a man seemingly at peace with his fate. He gave few interviews and showed little emotion, reinforcing the image of a man detached from the horror he had caused. On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins unit in Arkansas, ending the life of one of the state's most notorious killers. His execution was a somber event, attended by victims' families and law enforcement officials, and it brought closure to a chapter of tragedy that had shaken a community to its core. The legacy of Simmons' crimes continues to reverberate decades later. The massacre serves as a grim case study in the dangers of unchecked domestic abuse, the catastrophic consequences of isolation, and the potential for violence lurking behind the veneer of normalcy. It also highlights the importance of intervention and vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals from the destructive grasp of abusive family members. Simmons' story is a cautionary tale of how control, fear, and cruelty can escalate into unimaginable horror when left unchallenged. Ronald Gene Simmons' killing spree was marked not by chaos or sudden frenzy, but by a disturbingly methodical and systematic approach. Over the course of nearly a week during the Christmas season of 1987, Simmons orchestrated a series of murders that revealed a man who was terrifyingly organized and deliberate in his actions. This was not a random burst of violence, but a carefully executed plan to eliminate his family one by one, a horrifying manifestation of control, rage, and deep-seated pathology. Simmons' military background heavily influenced the way he carried out the murders. As a former Air Force sergeant, he possessed skills in discipline, tactics, and precision, which translated into the cold efficiency of his killing spree. Unlike many mass murderers who act impulsively, Simmons had clearly thought through the logistics of his rampage. He knew where each family member was likely to be, and he moved through the house and surrounding properties with the cold purpose of a commander executing a grim mission. The killings began on December 22, 1987, with the murder of his wife Shirley at their Dover, Arkansas home. From there, Simmons methodically proceeded to eliminate his children and grandchildren over the following days. He tracked them down with ruthless efficiency, often surprising them in moments of vulnerability. The use of a .22 caliber rifle gave him both control and lethality, enabling him to dispatch victims quickly, minimizing noise and potential resistance. This systematic approach was reflected in the order and manner in which the murders were committed. Simmons targeted the adults first, his sons, daughters, and extended family members, then moved on to the grandchildren. There was a grim logic to the sequence. Adults who could potentially oppose or expose him were eliminated before the children. The youngest victims were toddlers, unable to understand or resist the horror unfolding around them. Each murder was executed with an almost clinical detachment, underscoring the calculated nature of the spree. What stands out in the narrative of these murders is Simmons' chilling composure throughout. Eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence suggest he was methodical but calm, not exhibiting signs of panic or frenzy. His demeanor was that of a man carrying out a premeditated act of retribution, rather than an uncontrollable psychotic break. This composure allowed him to avoid detection for nearly a week, as the bodies remained undiscovered while he continued his deadly campaign. The house where the murders took place became a macabre crime scene. Simmons used the layout of the farmhouse and surrounding outbuildings to his advantage, isolating victims in different rooms and buildings to prevent escape or intervention. The forensic investigation later revealed the calculated nature of his movements, with each room and hallway bearing silent witness to the horrors inflicted within. The scene was one of devastation, but also of grim order, a testament to Simmons' cold planning. The killings extended beyond the family home. After completing his massacre, Simmons traveled to Russellville, Arkansas, where he murdered 2 co-workers at a local restaurant. This expansion of his violence beyond his immediate family highlighted the extent of his breakdown, but also his continued tactical mindset. The murders at the restaurant were swift and efficient, further demonstrating his capacity for calculated violence. In the days leading up to his surrender, Simmons avoided drawing attention to himself. He moved deliberately but cautiously, aware that law enforcement would soon close in. His eventual peaceful surrender was in itself a calculated decision, demonstrating a desire to control not just his victims, but also his own fate. Unlike other killers who flee or fight arrest, Simmons chose to give himself up, adding another layer of complexity to his psychological profile. The systematic nature of Simmons' killings also reveals disturbing insights into his psyche. The level of planning required points to a man who harbored intense resentment and rage, but who was able to suppress impulsive violence in favor of cold calculation. This ability to compartmentalize violence, to methodically execute it over days, speaks to a deeply disturbed mind capable of profound cruelty wrapped in an exterior of control. Law enforcement's response to the spree was hampered initially by the difficulty in grasping the scale and nature of the crime. The methodical killings meant that the bodies were not found immediately, and the pattern only became clear as the investigation unfolded. The slow discovery added to the horror and confusion, as neighbors and community members struggled to comprehend how a single man could annihilate an entire family with such ruthless efficiency. In retrospect, Simmons' killing spree stands as a stark example of how deeply ingrained abuse, control, and psychopathy can culminate in devastating violence. The methodical approach allowed him to extend his reign of terror over several days, maximizing the destruction before finally being stopped. It is a chilling reminder that mass murderers are not always impulsive or chaotic. Some, like Simmons, operate with the cold calculation of a man who has spent years preparing for this final, horrific act. After carrying out the horrifying murders of his family members, Ronald Gene Simmons did not immediately flee or go into hiding. Instead, his violence extended beyond his family, culminating in an attack on co-workers at a local restaurant in Russellville, Arkansas. This final act of aggression and his subsequent calm surrender to authorities add a perplexing and chilling layer to the story, highlighting the complexity of Simmons' psyche and the sheer scope of his descent into violence. Following the week-long killing spree, Simmons drove to Russellville, where he worked at a local pizza restaurant called Denny's. There, on December 29, 1987, he confronted two co-workers, shooting them both. These murders, unlike the family killings which were largely conducted in isolation, were witnessed by others and brought his violent rampage into public view. The fact that Simmons targeted people outside his family at this point suggests a broader collapse of his mental state and a desire to exert control and inflict harm beyond the private sphere of his home. The co-workers, Mary Helen Potts and James Lewis, were unsuspecting victims caught in the crossfire of Simmons' rage. His attack on them was swift and brutal, with little apparent provocation beyond his internal turmoil. This extension of his violence beyond the family circle showed that his murderous intent was no longer confined to personal grievances, but had spilled over into the community. It also marked a turning point in the case, drawing immediate law enforcement attention and mobilizing a manhunt. What is particularly striking about Simmons' behavior following these murders is his calm and deliberate decision to surrender to the police. Instead of attempting to evade capture, he walked into the local sheriff's office, reportedly stating, "I'm the one you're looking for." This act of voluntary surrender contrasts sharply with the violence he had just committed and suggests a complex psychological profile, one in which control remained paramount even in the face of impending arrest. Simmons' surrender also provided law enforcement with critical information. He confessed to the murders of his family members and co-workers, giving investigators insight into the full scope of his crimes. His willingness to talk about the killings, despite their brutality, shocked those who encountered him. Instead of displaying remorse or confusion, Simmons reportedly appeared cold and detached, offering a chilling glimpse into a man who viewed his actions with a disturbing level of acceptance. The surrender marked the end of the immediate threat to the community, but also the beginning of an intense legal and psychological examination of Simmons. His confession was comprehensive, and he cooperated with authorities, detailing the timeline and methods of his killings. This cooperation helped piece together the full horror of the massacre, though it also raised questions about his motives and mental state. Psychologists and criminal profilers who studied Simmons' case noted the unusual combination of cold-blooded murder and calm surrender. Unlike many mass killers who flee, resist arrest, or attempt to justify their actions with grandiose delusions, Simmons' behavior suggested a man who was resigned to his fate but unrepentant. His actions indicated a belief that he was delivering justice or enacting punishment on those he saw as responsible for his suffering and humiliation. The aftermath of the surrender saw Simmons placed into custody where he awaited trial and eventual sentencing. His lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his crimes ensured that the legal process would be both high-profile and emotionally charged. For the victims' families and the wider community, the surrender was a bitter end to a harrowing chapter, a moment when the full magnitude of Simmons' violence could finally be confronted. This phase of the story also sheds light on the broader societal implications of domestic violence and mass murder. Simmons' surrender forced the public and law enforcement to grapple with how a man could commit such atrocities and yet maintain a facade of control and calmness. It raised uncomfortable questions about the warning signs that were missed and the failures of systems designed to protect families from internal abuse and violence. In the years following his surrender, Simmons' case became a subject of study for criminal psychologists, law enforcement professionals, and advocates against domestic abuse. His combination of systematic family annihilation, extended violence, and voluntary surrender remains a chilling example of the extremes of human behavior. The calmness with which he faced justice contrasted starkly with the chaos and horror he had unleashed, leaving a legacy of trauma and reflection for all who encountered his story. Following his chilling surrender and confession to the murders of 16 people, including 14 of his own family members, and the attack on co-workers, Ronald Gene Simmons' path led inevitably to the courtroom. The trial was a grim and harrowing process, marked by the sheer scale of the crimes, the emotional devastation for the surviving victims and the community, and the cold, unrepentant demeanor of Simmons himself. This phase of the story not only served justice, but also illuminated the complexities of dealing with such a profoundly disturbed individual within the legal system. The legal proceedings began after Simmons was formally charged with multiple counts of murder. Given the overwhelming evidence, including his detailed confession, forensic evidence, and eyewitness testimonies, the case against him was virtually indisputable. Yet the trial was still necessary to ensure due process, provide a platform for victims' families to voice their pain, and hold Simmons accountable under the law. Throughout the trial, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief and shock. Family members who had survived the ordeal, as well as neighbors and community members, were present, many still struggling to comprehend the enormity of the loss. Simmons' crimes had shattered the sense of safety and normalcy in their small Arkansas community, and the trial brought the tragedy back into sharp focus for all involved. Simmons himself appeared detached throughout the proceedings. Unlike many defendants who show signs of remorse, anger, or desperation, he maintained a cold and stoic facade. His demeanor was consistent with the one he exhibited during the killings and surrender, calm, unemotional, and disturbingly matter-of-fact about the murders. This lack of visible remorse further alienated him from the courtroom and the public, reinforcing the portrait of a man deeply disconnected from empathy or conscience. The defense attempted to explore Simmons' mental state, but psychological evaluations painted a grim picture of a man fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Despite suffering from apparent psychological disturbances rooted in his abusive upbringing and personal history, Simmons was found competent to stand trial. The court rejected any insanity defense, concluding that his methodical planning and deliberate actions demonstrated a clear understanding of right and wrong. As the trial unfolded, graphic and heart-wrenching details emerged about the nature of the murders. The prosecution described the systematic and brutal killing of family members, including children and grandchildren, the shocking incestuous abuse, and the merciless efficiency of Simmons' rampage. These revelations deepened the horror felt by all who followed the case, emphasizing the inhumanity of the crimes. The jury deliberated but quickly reached a verdict. Simmons was guilty on all counts. Given the severity and premeditation of the murders, the death penalty was sought. The sentencing phase was swift, and Simmons was sentenced to death. For the community and the surviving family members, the verdict brought a measure of closure, a recognition of the terrible wrongs committed, and a formal judgment condemning the perpetrator. Simmons was sent to death row at the Tucker Maximum Security Unit in Arkansas. During his incarceration, he remained largely silent and unrepentant, showing little interest in appeals or attempts to mitigate his sentence. His attitude reinforced the narrative of a man who accepted his fate without seeking forgiveness or attempting to justify his actions beyond his initial confession. The execution was carried out on June 25, 1990, by lethal injection. Simmons became the first person executed in Arkansas since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. His death marked the final chapter in one of the most horrific and high-profile murder cases in Arkansas history. The execution was met with a complex mixture of relief, sorrow, and reflection by the victims' families, the community, and legal observers. The aftermath of the trial and execution sparked widespread discussion about the nature of justice, punishment, and the death penalty. Simmons' case became a somber example cited in debates over capital punishment, some arguing that his crimes warranted the ultimate penalty, others raising concerns about the deeper social and psychological issues that led to such tragedy. The case also brought renewed attention to domestic abuse, mental health, and the importance of intervention before violence escalates to this extreme. For the survivors and relatives of the victims, the trial and execution offered no true healing, only a formal acknowledgement of their suffering and the end of Simmons' reign of terror. The scars left behind by his actions would persist indefinitely, a constant reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of unchecked abuse and control. In historical and criminological contexts, Ronald Gene Simmons' trial and execution remain a case study in the administration of justice for mass murderers. It demonstrated the capacity of the legal system to process and respond to overwhelming tragedy, while also exposing the limitations of law in addressing the root causes of such violence. Simmons' story continues to resonate as a cautionary tale about the devastating impact of familial abuse, mental illness, and the dark side of human nature. One of the most haunting aspects of the Ronald Gene Simmons case is the chilling contrast between the horrific nature of his crimes and the seemingly ordinary life he presented to the outside world. For years, Simmons hid behind a carefully maintained mask of normalcy, a facade that concealed the deep-seated darkness within. This duality highlights the disturbing capacity for evil to exist beneath the surface of everyday life and leaves a lasting legacy of trauma that still resonates today. Before the murders, Ronald Gene Simmons was known in his community as a quiet, reserved man who worked at a local restaurant and lived a reclusive life with his large family. Neighbors and acquaintances rarely suspected the depths of his controlling behavior or the violent and abusive nature that defined his private life. This discrepancy between public appearance and private reality is a stark reminder of how abusers can manipulate perceptions to maintain control and avoid detection. His ability to conceal the abuse, incest, and terror he inflicted on his family for years allowed the cycle of violence to escalate unchecked. The isolation he imposed on his family members created an environment where escape or intervention was nearly impossible. This tragic dynamic is all too common in cases of domestic violence, where victims may be trapped by fear, manipulation, and lack of external support. The revelation of Simmons' crimes shattered the illusion of normalcy and forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the hidden suffering behind closed doors. It also sparked important conversations about the signs of abuse, the necessity of vigilance, and the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable individuals, especially children. His story became a powerful example of why ignoring or dismissing warning signs can have devastating consequences. Beyond the immediate horror of the murders, the legacy of trauma persists for the survivors, the families of victims, and the wider community. The psychological scars left by Simmons' actions run deep, affecting generations. Counseling, support groups, and continued awareness efforts have been critical in helping those impacted begin to heal, but the shadow of the tragedy remains a poignant reminder of what was lost. The case also left a lasting imprint on law enforcement, social services, and the justice system in Arkansas and beyond. It exposed gaps in the detection and prevention of domestic abuse and underscored the importance of proactive intervention. Efforts to improve communication between agencies, provide better resources for abuse victims, and educate the public have grown in part due to lessons learned from this case. Ronald Gene Simmons' story is a stark cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked control and violence within families. It challenges society to look beyond appearances, listen to victims, and act decisively to prevent such tragedies. The mask he wore was eventually torn away, revealing a monstrous reality, one that continues to serve as a grim reminder of the depths to which human cruelty can sink. Thank you so much for watching this documentary on Ronald Gene Simmons. If you found this video informative and impactful, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear which parts of the story stood out to you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories and deep dives into some of the most complex cases in history. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to light.